today's video, I will be breaking down my entire digital illustration process, going in depth into every single aspect of it. This video is probably going to be long, might break an hour, but I hope you find it highly informative and useful. There's going to be a bit of time-lapse, a bit of voiceover, maybe a little bit of me talking to you on the screen just to break it up, make it a little bit more fun, maybe a skit or two or something in there. It'll just be a fun, semi-educational journey. Now, I would like to preface this by saying that in art, there are really no rules. You know, there are rules and methods and techniques and all that, but in the end, you don't necessarily have to do things the same way I do them. You'll find your own way eventually. I think it's important to take a little piece of something from every illustrator that inspires you, like a little bit over there, a little bit over there. That, I think, is the best way to learn art, is just to kind of grab like one or two things from every different illustrator that you like. And it's always important to view art outside of your own, I guess, genre, if you would call it. I'm going to stop doing this little preamble, and yeah, I'm back to making videos because I just couldn't stay away, man. Hope you like the new audio setup thing I got going on. I'm going to try to improve the audio and, you know, mess around with the lights and, you know, get a little bit of set dressing going. Enough bullshit, let's just get into the time-lapse. Before we begin, let's talk about file setup. New file. So I like to start at about 10 by 15 at 300 DPI CMYK color. I do CMYK because that's for print, and there's always the chance that your stuff can get printed. You can always crop it later as you work, so I just like to do 10 by 15. It's like standard American comic book size, which you guys know if you've been watching the channel that I'm more of like a comic book artist. Also, I should note that 300 DPI, or PPI, sometimes it's referred to, resolution for print. If you're going to do anything for screen, you can go all the way down to 72 DPI or PPI if you're doing like animation or something like that. But I'm doing one piece of artwork with the intention of potentially maybe printing it. I don't know. After you finish the artwork, you could always just like compress it down. You could always make it smaller. You can't make it larger. So I like to start kind of large. Alright, and I got a white page. I don't like that. I unlock that layer. I get like a middle tone gray kind of look. Boom, because you know, with that harsh white, it like kind of muddies up the colors and you make them like too bright. That is gray. I'll show you in the screen cap. Get your standard brush and we start sketching, and we're gonna go into the screen cap right now. Okay, so the first thing I do is change the background completely gray, like I said before I hit the record button on the time lapse. This is because on a white background, colors can appear way duller than they actually are, and on a dark background, colors can appear way more vibrant than they are. So if you use gray, it's a nice middle tone, so it doesn't confuse your eyes. And some people might be saying like, well, about like traditional art on white paper. The thing is, traditional paper is not an actual true white. There is no true white or black in nature. Just thought I'd throw that out there for you. Anyway, the next thing I do is I lock the background layer after I figured out the size I'm gonna go. You know, because sometimes when you start doing an illustration, you might end up cropping the image, you know, making it bigger or changing the dimensions a little bit. But basically, once I get my first little sketch on there and figure out like how big or small it is, I'm gonna lock the background layer. Okay? And then I go through a process of iterative sketches, which is pretty normal. So, you know, I gotta get a rough gesture going, right? Kind of get an idea, a concept, a character, whatever. Just sort of get like a really loose, dirty, ugly sketch going. So in this case, I drew my character, Anna, in a military uniform because, well, military uniforms are kind of hot. Anyway, I did pull up some references too to get a more realistic look to the outfit. You know, obviously I made it a little bit more provocative just for, you know, the sake of mass appeal, you know, and all that, because I wanted to. And I did reference I believe it's called a submachine gun for the weapon she's holding, or an Uzi. I think Uzi's just a slang word. I think it's actually just called like submachine gun. I don't know, not a gun guy. Anyway, so next thing I do is something that I've added to my process recently, and I think might be beneficial to you. I think it's making my colors look better. I don't know. I'm not experienced enough with it. There was this video recently by a YouTuber, fellow artist YouTuber called Tazak. I believe it was Tazak. I'll link it in the description, where he broke down Wallop's process. You guys know Wallop. Everybody knows Wallop. Even if you don't know his name, you've definitely seen his art. But he broke down how Wallop uses curves to kind of create more vibrant colors. And it's kind of interesting. So what you do is you make a grayscale layer. So where you would put in flat colors underneath the line art, right? After you finalize the line work, you put in grayscale on, you know, lighter grays for lighter things, like for instance her skin, and darker grays for darker things, for instance the outfit. You put in an adjustment layer on top of the grayscale called curves, right? If you click that little it's like a circle it's like a pokeball looking thing. You click on that and you click on curves and you get this little chart, kind of adjust the intensity of certain lights and darks, and it can kind of give you some cool effects, and it can kind of mess it up too. It's sort of one of those things you just gotta play with until you get it. But an interesting thing about it is that you can go to specific color channels depending if you're working on RGB or CMYK. So I work in CMYK, so I got cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. So I could go in there and like I could blast the cyan through the roof if I wanted to, or just like totally cut out the magenta or whatever. The standard one kind of adjusts all of them. It's a little bit hard to explain. Like I said, I'll link that other video. It's, again, it's something you just gotta play with until you get. Now you may be wondering, like, well, this is a color piece. What happened then? What I do after that is I add a flat color layer, right? We go on top of that, right? And we add the initial colors, right? And then what we do is we lower the opacity of the flat layer, the flat color layer, just so that gray with like a little hint of like any kind of tints or tones or shades kind of pokes through a little bit. And I also went down to the gray layer and started shading with a soft round brush at a low opacity to give it a little bit more of a gradation, and that kind of pokes through a little bit, and I think it looks better. I'm not sure. You guys let me know in the comments, but that's what I did for the shadows, or at least the first initial shadows. And I should also mention, so then I do a layer on top of the first flat layer, which is at a lower opacity. Now if you pay attention to the percentage and the layers in the menu over there as I'm talking about this, you may have noticed like they're going all over the place. But I put a layer of highlights that are the actual color. So I go down to the initial flat color layer, select it at full opacity, and put a highlight layer on top of it that is that color, but lower the opacity of the first layer of flats, if that makes sense. I hope it makes sense. And yeah, that's what I do for the first highlights. You know, figure out the light source, where the light's hitting. Alright, the light's lighter there, that's where the highlights go. And I should also mention layer modes, which is a fun little thing that you can do. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's stylistic, sometimes it looks bad. But if you click that menu that's next to the opacity and the layers, I'm sure if you're using any other kind of layer-based art program, it'll have this thing for you too. It will give you different effects. So I believe I put this one into vivid light for the initial highlights. I'll put it on screen when I go to edit this. But yeah, like vivid light will make it like pop a little bit more. Or the ones I use the most are vivid light, multiply, and overlay, and sometimes color dodge. We'll get to that towards the end. Multiply basically makes your colors darker. I'm not sure. This is just sort of like what my eyes are seeing, not like the technical jargon. Vivid light kind of makes everything just saturated. Multiply makes the colors darker and like a little bit muddier. I use it for my shadows. We'll get to that. Overlay is basically exactly what it sounds like. It makes it look like an overlay. Think a transparency or something like that, right? And then there's color dodge, which makes everything like glowy. We'll get to that. So that's the first initial steps I take in this process. Before we continue, I'd like to tell you this video is sponsored by Yo Mama. Kidding, this video is sponsored by nobody, but check out my website. You can buy all types of stuff like... Hey guys, Editor John here. So far as my store is concerned, I'm probably going to switch over to a print-on-demand service. I will still be putting original artwork on my web store, but, you know, when it comes to, like, merch and prints and stuff like that, I'm probably going to try to find a good print-on-demand service to use for that. I've been doing a lot of research on that, so, yeah, there's probably going to be nothing on my site by the time this video goes up. So, yeah, just read my comic instead. Back to the video. And also check out my comic, Doomsayer. Dark fantasy epic kind of story. So, yeah, this part is just to break it up a little bit. I'm going to be back into whatever illustration I'm making because I'm recording the on-screen parts before I actually make the art because that's how I roll. Okay, anyway, yeah, back into it. camera transition thing. The next thing I do is I add a layer of cast shadow. So we've already established where the light is coming from, at least the first light source, because there are actual multiple light sources in this piece in particular, which we will get to towards the end. The harshest light is coming from like the top left, right? So we gotta add a cast shadow because she's standing there, she's kind of looking like she's floating. If your characters look like they're floating in space, your shadows are probably messed up. I take a really dark and saturated deep blue for this. At least in this piece, the color mood was kind of more towards the blues. You gotta consider the temperature of the colors in the piece and the like vibe you're trying to go for. So I was going for like more muted, darker, bluer colors. Yeah, so for the shadows, I use like a really deep blue that's really dark. So if you're looking in like the color box, you want to move it towards the bottom right, as opposed to the bottom left. Stay away from the actual pure black, because like I said earlier, there is no pure black in nature. So yeah, what I do there is I just kind of make a cast shadow where she's standing in this piece, and I just kind of drag it off the screen, and I lowered the opacity of that layer and set the mode to multiply. Like I said, it makes it darker. I don't know why or how, but that's what it does. Then I add a second layer of highlights, which I believe I used like a pinkish purple for this, and I set the mode to vivid light. So I just took a soft round brush at a low opacity and kind of highlighted the areas that are like closest to the light, most exposed. I think it turned out okay. You know, I kind of keep changing the process of how I do my stuff as I go along, but I think this method is working out for me. And then I set that mode to vivid light. Then I do something that's really unique to my own style. I do something that I'm gonna call line softening. I like to find like a middle ground, a bit of a semi-realistic illustrative style, if that's a sentence. Basically what I do is I take a soft round eraser at a low opacity. Well, first thing I do is actually lower the opacity of the line layer just a little bit, because if you make it too transparent or translucent, one of them, it's gonna look weird in certain places, like especially in the eyes, because I like to draw these characters with like heavy eye makeup. It's gonna look weird. I just lower the opacity just a little, then I go in with a soft round eraser to just kind of like soften up the areas where there wouldn't really be lines, or like it would have a softer edge, like for instance the cleavage or the collarbone, and areas that are like a little bit deeper in shadow. So something I learned recently from one of these internet videos, you know, there's tons of them, I'm making one too. Something I learned recently is that in shadow you lose detail. Okay, so to make your shadows a little bit more dramatic, the areas that are closer to the darkness should lose detail. So you shouldn't like be adding 10 million lines to something that's dipped in the shadow. So that's the area where I target the lines and soften them up with the eraser tool. And I think it looks pretty good. In other areas too, like the hair, I think it kind of gives it a bit of a unique look. But yeah, that's my line softening process. I added another layer of shadows on top of the colors because my initial shadows were in the grayscale layer. So what I do there is I actually use that same like deep blue I was talking about for the cast shadow layer, or a similar color. I don't know, I can't keep track of everything. And I basically do the same thing that I did with the highlights with the soft round brush, you know, lower opacity, but I set it to multiply. That's the layer mode I use. I think it just looks better. I'm not, again, like I said, I'm not really sure about the technical jargon about what it does, but that's what I do for the shadows, the next shadow layer. And then I do one more shadow layer called ambient occlusion. I just mark it as AC because I'm not writing that out every time. Make sure you name your layers too, especially if you're going to keep adding more and more and more. It's important to like name your layers, or at least have a shorthand for it. Ambient occlusion is an interesting thing. It sounds like a fancy pants word. Like, ooh, ambient occlusion. Ooh, that's so sophisticated. But what it really is it's just a fancy name for basically ambient light. So like, let's say the sun or something is going to reflect off of everything and bounce everywhere, right? So that's the ambient light, you know, the light that's just kind of naturally existing in the space being occluded, which occlusion is just a fancy word for like blocking or obscured or like covered up. So it's like the area where no light at all reaches. So like under her feet, you know, or like in areas like where there's barely any space for light to get through, like under her breast, for instance. That's what ambient occlusion is. It's just a fancy word for like the darkest part of a shadow. That's all it is. I set the mode to linear burn. Usually I would set it to multiply, but I messed around with the layer modes because they're fun, and I ended up liking what the linear burn looked like the most, so that was what I did there for the ambient occlusion. Again, guys, I would just like to reiterate that this is not necessarily the best method, okay? This is just my method, okay? So whichever method works out for you the best, you know, there's plenty of other online digital art tutorials and lessons that, you know, might be better suited for your needs, but this is just how I do things. So if you found it useful, thank you very much. Leave a like, maybe a sub. But if you didn't, hey, let me know. Tell me what I did wrong. Give me some advice on how you do things. That'd be cool. I like to create this little community here where you could all just, you know, help each other improve. That'd be nice. So let's wrap this up with the final steps. I can't snap. I can't snap. Can't whistle either. I feel like people can either do both or neither. Can't snap. Can't whistle. No. Anyway, let's just add snap sound effects in post. Now we're going to do a little bit of a John special here, okay? This next couple of things is like pretty much specific to me, I think. Well, a few things. Maybe the other people do similar stuff and have specific names for them, but whatever. So I do this thing with these stylistic white highlights is what I call them, which is another layer of highlights on top of everything. That's just like a pure white line. I don't know, it just kind of makes it pop a little bit more. Makes it pop. Don't you hate when people say that? Make it pop. But I really do think the actual white highlights make things pop a little bit more, but I put that all the way on top over the lines and everything. But then I set it to overlay, so it's not like overpowering. Like I said before, it's overlay makes it like an overlay. It's like putting a film on top of something. And I do a little something I like to call layer checking. By the time I'm at here, I just go through my layers and make sure I put everything in the right spot and everything's at the right like opacity and layer mode, and you know, everything's named correctly. So I do that as I go, but I kind of put this down here on my checklist. I think it's important to kind of keep track of things. And as soon as you start getting to like enough layers where it's like, oh man, I gotta scroll through to look at all of them, that's when you gotta like start checking and making sure you didn't mess up, because it is possible to draw on the wrong layer. Of course, once you're finished with the layer, you can lock it, which is what I do for the background at least. But I'm always kind of going back and forth between things and changing things, so you know, I'm never really truly done. But yeah, that's kind of a process that I think you should incorporate into your work if you're working digitally, whether that's Photoshop, Procreate, Clip Studio, whatever. So make sure you check your layers as you go. Alright, next up is effect that I've been doing that I did not understand. I just thought it looked cool, but now I actually understand what it is. I've been calling it like a haze effect, which is not the right word. The right word is subsurface scattering. In this piece, there's actually a backlight. There's this thing called subsurface scattering. I will splice in a video of me demonstrating it. Subsurface scattering is a fancy word, just like ambient occlusion, for something that's actually really simple to explain. There are parts of, so certain things that you may perceive as opaque actually have certain areas that are somewhat translucent. A common example is a light going through fingertips, or fingers, not fingertips. When you put your hand together and then put it in front of a light, like you put your fingers together and put it in front of a light, the light's going to poke through those lines. So subsurface scattering is basically the light just poking through areas where you would think it would be an opaque thing. Now, this is mostly applicable to human bodies because, you know, there's like if you put a flashlight in your mouth, highly don't recommend, don't do that. Your cheeks are gonna light up, okay? Now you may think like, what? Human faces are opaque. Not true. It's sort of the same idea of as a diffuser, right? So if you put up a big professional light and then you put a diffuser on it, if you pull out that diffuser and look at the diffuser by itself, it's going to look opaque. But as soon as you put it in front of the light is going to poke through, and the light's going to diffuse out. That's sort of what subsurface scattering is. Now I kind of overdo it because it looks cool. Set it to color dodge mode, lower the opacity, and put it through a Gaussian blur. Usually a heavy Gaussian blur, which is my favorite kind of blur. There are different types of blur, but my favorite's Gaussian because it just does what I want it to. I kind of overdo it, but it's sort of a stylistic thing. If you think about like the Rococo era of painting, I'll put in that famous painting from the era, The Swing, where the light's really just ethereal and just kind of all over the place, but it looks cool. So that's kind of what I was going for there, and that's subsurface scattering. Then I added the background elements. I'm sure because I explained subsurface scattering for so long that I've already gotten to that in the time lapse. So I actually put that in underneath the curves layer just to kind of push it back so it's a little bit darker, because the way I adjusted the curves, I made the piece a little bit bluer on the bottom in the grayscale. So I did that, you know, kind of ran it through a couple of blurs and all that. Just sort of a light in the background was the first thing I put, and then I put a beam coming off. I'll explain how I did that because there was another one in the front that's basically done the same way. Then I did something called photo bashing. Now this is actually a pretty common practice amongst digital artists. Basically, you get a free image. Please use a free image, and if you don't use a copy, if you do end up using a copyrighted image, like make sure you change it enough where they can't tell. Just to be safe, I'd recommend a website called Pexels. That's Pexels, where you can look up all kinds of textures, and that's like all free, like stock stuff that you can use. Like you don't have to worry about legal stuff. It's like 100% free to use. For the most part. I think they have like a premium subscription that gets you like nicer stuff, but the free version you can get like stock free stuff where you don't have to pay for it or anything. But yeah, photo bashing, again, use those royalty free ones, is when you take a photo and you bash it into the artwork. Usually what I do is I get the photo texture, in this case I use like wood, like a wood grain, or like wood pillars, not pillars, planks, right, for the wall. And I set it to an overlay mode. I also desaturated it to make it black and white. So basically it's just sort of adding the texture to it. So when you set it to overlay mode, it kind of drains out the color a little bit. But if you desaturate it, it gets rid of the color entirely. If you go to image, adjustments, hue saturation, and just turn the saturation all the way down, I'll turn it black and white, and again, as I said, if I set it to overlay, it's like a transparent like texture on top of it, and you know, adds a little bit more personality to the image. Next thing I do is I go underneath that, and then I go to the gray layer that I locked in the beginning. This is usually what I do for all my pieces, and when it's coming towards the end, I'll either go lighter or darker, so I'll set it either to like just black or white, or maybe like a blue or like a dark red or something, depending on the mood. In this case, I think I set it to a black. Because of all the stuff on top of it, it doesn't look black in the background, but it just gets darkened that way. So that's how I do it. Now you could also put like white and lighten everything up, but in this case I want it to be darker because I wanted it to stand out in the front a little bit more. Plus this is kind of a little bit of a darker piece. But yeah, basically I would go back in, and the like light that I put in there, like the interrogation light I threw in there, I set that layer mode to vivid light. And then I put a beam in the front to kind of give it a frontal light source, or one off to the side that kind of emphasizes the shadow that she's casting, and like, you know, the darker shadows in certain spots. So I put that all the way on top of everything. I lowered the opacity, of course. I set it, I think I made it like kind of a hot blue. That's a thing. And then I ran it through a bunch of different layer modes and ended up on linear burn because that looked the coolest. Now normally I would have set something like that to overlay, but I like to go through the whole menu and just see how it looks, because sometimes it'll look terrible and sometimes modes you didn't think of would look really cool. On top of that, I added some rays, or like light rays, which might be hard to see because of compression. I would take a soft round brush and just kind of draw some lines with a low opacity, right? And then run it through a few blurs, a few Gaussian blurs, just to kind of make it look a little bit more realistic. Maybe not realistic, more like stylistic. You don't really see rays like that in real life too much. But yeah, I think it looks kind of cool, so I went with that. Then I do a little something that I call particles. This is only specifically to pieces with like beams of light poking in. Have you ever seen like a light that's been on for a while or something like that, like a camera light or like professional studio lights? It'll get like these dust particles that become visible. You know what I mean? You guys know what I'm talking about? I'll put a picture in here. I'm sure I can find an image. So I kind of try to go for that with the spatter brush. I adjust the brush elements so it's not like a bajillion splatters. This is like stock Photoshop brush, by the way, or at least in the newer versions. and then I set it to an outer glow, usually something in the color temperature range of what the piece is, so probably around the blue. And obviously I turn down the opacity of that because, you know, they're kind of hard to see, but like I kind of want them there. It gives it more depth, more personality, more realism. So onto the finishing touches. We're almost there, guys. All right, I hear you. You're like, Professor, can I go home? I shit myself because you were taking so long. Professor, imagine me a professor, God. Anyway, don't shit yourself, all right? We're almost done. Just a couple of finishing touches. All right, so remember when I talked about the subsurface scattering that I used to call like a haze effect or whatever? This is more of like a stylistic thing. I believe Ross Draws does the same thing. Basically what I've been doing in my most recent pieces is I've been adding a layer on top and setting it to color dodge. The first thing I was trying to do was trying to make the hair glow a little bit more. There's an artist I follow on Instagram. I think he's on other things. His name is his or her name or them or whatever these days. But I'm not going to get into that. Whatever. That artist's name is Razarus. And I noticed they would always like have this really glow to the hair whenever they would draw anybody. So I was trying to emulate that, and I kind of figured it out after a while. It would get like really rough and loose, but like it would glow for some reason, and it took me forever to figure it out. I think I got it. So what I do is I add a layer called color dodge all the way to the top, and I select the colors of the specific parts, so like red for the hair, or like I guess like a gray for the gun and stuff like that. And I would go over it with the soft round brush, right? And it will look cool, but it's like way too much and it's covering everything. So I would run it through a little bit of a blur and lower the opacity heavily, but not too much, just enough where it would still kind of glow. And I think it looks really cool. I made sure I also got the eyes, because I kind of like the eyes to be piercing, especially if the character's looking straight at the camera, I guess you could say. I should also mention that like I would select the flat color and then just kind of raise it. I guess raise is the right word, like, you know, towards the top left in the color selector thing. And I ran over some parts, with my car. Yeah, I just ran it over. No, ran over some parts with a soft round eraser at a low opacity just to kind of tone it down in areas where it didn't look, kind of get that Rococo style I was talking about earlier. And then I added one more thing called that I'm calling a vignette. If you guys ever like ran through Photoshop filters or Camera Raw filters, there's this thing called a vignette, which basically adds like a black shadow outline to things. Looks kind of cool. I'm not sure exactly where this effect started or why, but I think it just kind of makes the focal point more of a focus. So I kind of ran that into the background, or like on top of the curves, I think, or maybe just underneath the curves, above all the background elements. Ran a dark blue around the edges, kind of created like a circle, and blurred the shit out of it. Heavy Gaussian. Is it Gaussian or Gaussian? I don't know. Tell me in the comments. Blur, and then lower the opacity, set it to multiply. Looks good. Bing, bang, boom. Done. Right? So next up was exporting. When I export my files, I export them as JPEG for the internet because, like I said earlier, when I start a piece, I set it to CMYK at a high res and 300 dpi. But when I put it on the internet, I don't want it so people could steal it and print it and pass it off as their own for the most part. There's always going to be a chance that somebody's going to steal your art, so even the robots are stealing art, but I made a whole video about that already. What I do is I usually bring it down to like something like 1080 by whatever or something around that range, because my pieces are usually like 2000 by something in terms of pixels, and I export them as JPEGs. But if you're gonna print something, you should export it as a TIFF or some other printable file, but I think the standard is still TIFF. But if you're just gonna post on the internet, JPEGs. PNGs look a little bit nicer. They have a little less compression, but they don't load as fast. So if you upload a ton of PNGs to your website to be like, hey, look at my portfolio, somebody might open that and like it'll take forever to load, and they'll be like, I have the attention span of half of a goldfish, and they ain't gonna see your art. But if you do have the attention span higher than a goldfish, thank you for watching this video. Alright, that was my whole process. I'm gonna take it back over to On Camera John to wrap this up. Okay, and to wrap this up, I just want to say thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you found it useful, informative, or maybe just entertaining, or well edited. Probably not well edited, probably horribly done. But if you want to see more bad videos, please subscribe to the channel. I very much appreciate that. You know, drop a like, comment, all that, give me your thoughts, feelings, complaints, you know, diatribes, rants, so on and so forth. I'll come up with a good outro with that basis eventually. Thank you very much for watching, it means a lot. So here's the final finished piece with my whole method explained. Thank you.